Surviving the Arabian winter siege was basically Allah's way of testing who really believed in that faith over comfort thing. While history books love to show us scenes of noble warriors clashing with gleaming swords, the reality for the Sahaba at the Battle of Khandaq was more like living in a mass grave. They were digging for themselves, while an army 3 times their size waited to bury them in it. When you had to wake up before Fajr with a stone tied to your stomach because the hunger pangs were so brutal you couldn't stand upright, you knew this wasn't going to be a regular battle. The companions were staring down 10,000 enemy soldiers, a force larger than the entire population of Medina, while digging a defensive trench 6 kilometers long. That's roughly 36 cricket stadiums placed end to end. Or if you want to visualize it differently, you could fit 6,560 Toyota Corollas bumper to bumper inside that ditch. But here's where it gets worse. This isn't just man versus man. It's man versus nature, man versus starvation, and man versus betrayal, all at the same time. Because while you're out there digging with bleeding hands and a frozen spine, the Jewish tribe you had a treaty with inside your own city, the Banu Qurayza, is about to flip sides. Which means the enemy won't just be at your doorstep, they'll be in your backyard, where your families sleep. But before the first shovel broke ground, there was a moment of pure mathematical horror. The Prophet Muhammad ﷺ sat in emergency council with his commanders, and every calculation pointed to the same conclusion. If they met Abu Sufyan's army in open battle, the Muslims would be wiped out before the sun reached its zenith. This wasn't strategy. This was arithmetic. 3,000 against 10,000, and most of those 3,000 were families who'd never held a sword. The room was silent, except for the sound of men doing mental funeral calculations. Then Salman al-Farisi stood up. Salman the Persian, the former slave who'd traveled half the world searching for truth and found it in this unlikely desert city. And he said something that sounded completely unhinged. In Persia, when we couldn't fight, we dug. A ditch, not a wall, not a fortress, a trench. The Arab commanders stared at him like he'd suggested they grow wings. This wasn't how warfare worked in the Arabian Peninsula. You met your enemy face to face. You fought with honor. You didn't hide in a hole like a frightened animal. But the Prophet ﷺ looked at the map of Medina and saw what Salman saw. The city was naturally protected on 3 sides by volcanic rock formations and dense palm groves. Geographical choke points that would force any attacker into narrow kill zones. The vulnerability was the northern plain. Wide open, perfect for cavalry charges. But what if that plain became impassable? What if they turned 6 kilometers of flat ground into a canyon that no horse would dare jump and no soldier could cross without becoming a target? The decision was made in minutes. They would dig, and they had less than a week to finish before 10,000 men arrived to bury them. The digging began before dawn, and it revealed a cruelty that no enemy could match. Hunger. Not the kind of hunger where you're irritable before lunch. The kind where your body starts consuming itself. Where you wake up and your vision swims because there's no glucose left in your blood. Where standing upright feels like balancing on a ship in a storm because your muscles are eating themselves for fuel. The companions had already been rationing for days before the dig began. By the time they were waist-deep in frozen earth, swinging pickaxes and hauling rocks, they were running on nothing. And that's when the stones came out. Not metaphorical stones, literal rocks. Flat, smooth stones tied with strips of cloth directly against their abdomens, pressed tight against the stomach lining. The pressure tricked the body. It suppressed the muscle contractions. It quieted the screaming nerve endings that were begging for food that didn't exist. 1 stone meant you'd skip multiple meals. 2 stones meant you were in dangerous territory. The Prophet himself was spotted with 3 stones bound to his midsection, digging alongside men who would have collapsed if they stopped moving, and the timeline was absolutely insane. 6 kilometers of trench. deep enough to swallow a horse and rider, wide enough that no amount of bravery would make a man try to jump it. And they had maybe 5 or 6 days before the largest army in Arabian history showed up. So they dug in shifts, through the night, through the cold, through the delirium. Men would swing a pickaxe until their hands bled through the calluses, then tie rags around their palms and keep swinging. Because the alternative wasn't defeat, it was extinction. And extinction doesn't care how tired you are. Then they hit it. A boulder so massive it stopped the entire excavation. Not a stone you could work around a geological middle finger from the earth itself, planted right in the path of the trench. Men attacked it with pickaxes, and the pickaxes shattered. They tried to dig around it and found it extended in every direction like the tip of a buried mountain. The timeline was already impossible. This rock just made it a death sentence. The workers were panicking. Some were calling it a sign. Others were doing the math on how much time they'd lose trying to break through. Then the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ walked over, took a sledgehammer, and said something that must have sounded insane to men who hadn't eaten in days. "Let me." The first strike split the rock with a flash of light. And he said, "I have been given the keys to Syria." The men stared. They were starving in a ditch, about to be slaughtered, and he was talking about conquering empires. The second strike shattered another section. "I have been given the keys to Persia." Persia, the superpower of the ancient world, the empire that had never been conquered. The third strike pulverized what remained. "I have been given the keys to Yemen." There's a moment in every story where the protagonist is at their absolute lowest point and gets a glimpse of the impossible future. This was that moment. These men had stones tied to their stomachs to survive the day, and they were being promised they'd conquer the known world. The contrast was so absurd, it should have felt like mockery. But it didn't. Because the Prophet wasn't speaking to their present circumstances. He was anchoring them to a future so certain that the present suffering became temporary. The rock that should have stopped them became the moment they saw past the siege, and they kept digging. The trench was finished just hours before the army arrived, and when Abu Sufyan's forces crested the hill and saw what the Muslims had done, they stopped dead, because this wasn't in the playbook. Arab warfare didn't include moats. This was a foreign tactic, a Persian trick, and it turned their 10,000-man advantage into a logistical nightmare. They couldn't charge. They couldn't siege. They could only wait on the opposite side of a 6-kilometer wound in the earth and hope the Muslims starved first. So began the worst part, the watch. Standing guard in rotating shifts along the trench, staring across at an army that outnumbered you 3-1, knowing that if they found a way across, your families were dead. And the cold. People don't realize how brutal desert nights get in winter. The same sand that bakes you alive during the day becomes a heat vacuum after sunset. The temperature plunges. The wind cuts through wool like it's gauze. The Sahaba didn't have winter gear. They had simple cloaks, tunics, and in some cases just wraps of cloth. They stood there all night, every night, watching for movement across the trench while their fingers went numb and their teeth chattered so hard they thought their jaws would crack. But the physical cold was survivable. It was the psychological cold that nearly broke them. The Quran describes it perfectly. When they came at you from above and below, and when eyes grew wild and hearts reached the throats. That's not poetic language. That's the physiological response to existential terror. Your heart rate spikes so hard you can feel your pulse in your throat. Your eyes dilate in the dark, searching for threats that could come from anywhere. Because you're not just cold and starving, you're waiting to die. Then, the worst-case scenario activated. The Banu Qurayza, the Jewish tribe living inside Medina's southern quarter, bound by treaty to remain neutral, sent word to Abu Sufyan, "We're in." Just like that, the trench became irrelevant. Because the enemy wasn't just outside anymore. They were inside, in the secure zone, where the women and children had been sheltered, where the families slept behind unlocked doors because they trusted the treaty. The moment the news broke, you could feel the air change in the Muslim camp. This wasn't a setback, this was checkmate. The trench held the enemy at bay in the north, but now there was no defense in the south. No walls, no barriers. Just a hostile force with access to the most vulnerable people in Medina and an external army waiting for the signal to coordinate a pincer attack. Abu Sufyan saw the opportunity immediately and sent emissaries with an offer. Give us 1/3 of your date harvest and we'll leave. 1/3 of the crops. That's the price for survival. It wasn't even an unreasonable demand by siege standards, it was practically generous. The Prophet ﷺ was ready to consider it. Because what's a harvest compared to the lives of children? But before he could agree, the leaders of the Ansar, the natives of Medina who had sheltered the Muslims when they had nothing, stood up and said, "We didn't tie stones to our stomachs and dig this trench to pay tribute to men who came to kill us." They rejected the deal, not out of bravado, out of something harder to quantify, dignity. They'd rather face annihilation on their feet than survive on their knees. So the answer went back to Abu Sufyan. No. And the siege tightened like a noose. That's when a man no one expected walked into the Muslim camp and changed everything. Nu'aym ibn Mas'ud, a member of the Ghatafan tribe, one of the Confederate groups allied with Abu Sufyan. He'd been on the other side. He'd marched with the 10,000. But somewhere between leaving his tent and crossing the trench, he'd made a decision that would fracture an empire-sized army. He found the Prophet ﷺ and said 3 words, "I have accepted Islam." The Prophet looked at him and said something that should be in every strategy manual ever written. "You are only one man among us. Go back and try to turn them against each other." War is deception. One man, a double agent who nobody on the enemy side knew, had flipped. And his mission wasn't to fight, it was to whisper. Nu'aym went back to the Banu Qurayza first. He'd known them for years, traded with them, shared meals. He sat down with their leaders and said, "You made a huge mistake siding with the Quraysh. Because if this siege fails, Abu Sufyan will pack up his army and leave, and you'll still be here, inside Medina, surrounded by very angry Muslims who will remember that you betrayed them." He let that sink in. Then he offered the solution. "Before you fully commit, demand hostages from the Quraysh. High-value captives. That way, even if they retreat, they'll have to come back and protect their own people and you." It was brilliant. It was poison. And the Banu Qurayza took the bait. Then Nu'aym walked across the battlefield to Abu Sufyan's tent and said, "I need to warn you about something. The Jews are having second thoughts. I heard they might demand hostages from you as a loyalty test, but it's actually a trap. They're going to hand those hostages over to Muhammad as a peace offering to save themselves." Abu Sufyan's face went cold. If they ask for hostages, refuse. One man, 2 conversations. The alliance was already cracking. The next day, the Banu Qurayza sent a message to Abu Sufyan. "We need a guarantee of your commitment. Send us 70 of your nobles as hostages." Abu Sufyan read the message and saw exactly what Nu'aym had warned him about, a trap. The Jews were going to flip again and hand his commanders to Muhammad on a silver platter. His reply was immediate, no. The Banu Qurayza received his refusal and saw exactly what Nu'aym had warned them about. The Quraysh were planning to abandon them. They weren't real allies, they were opportunists who'd leave the Jews to face the consequences alone. Trust evaporated. Suspicion metastasized. Abu Sufyan started pulling his forces back from advanced positions, worried the Jews would attack him from behind. The Banu Qurayza refused to commit fighters, worried the Quraysh would retreat and leave them exposed. Meetings between the allied commanders turned into interrogations. Why won't you send hostages? Why won't you attack from the south? The coalition that had been terrifying in its unity was now a circular firing squad of paranoia. And through it all, the Muslims just watched from across the trench. They didn't have to do anything. The enemy was destroying itself. Coordination collapsed. Joint operations were cancelled. The Confederate tribes started bickering over supplies, over positioning, over who was doing more of the work. The massive advantage of numbers meant nothing if those numbers didn't trust each other. Abu Sufyan could see it unraveling, but he couldn't stop it. Because the moment you start suspecting your allies, every action they take looks like betrayal, every hesitation looks like sabotage. Nuaym hadn't defeated the army. He'd made them defeat themselves. And the cold was about to finish the job. It started as a murmur on the horizon. A dark smudge of cloud rolling in from the east like a bruise spreading across the sky. The temperature dropped even further. Then the wind hit. Not a breeze. A roaring, violent wall of air that slammed into the Confederate camp like the fist of something angry. Tents that had been staked into the ground for weeks were ripped from their moorings and sent tumbling across the desert like shredded fabric. Fires that had been carefully maintained for warmth and cooking were snuffed out in seconds, leaving thousands of men in complete darkness. Cooking pots overturned, spilling what little food they had into the sand. Horses screamed and broke their tethers, scattering into the night. Men scrambled to hold down what was left of their shelters, but the wind didn't care about human effort. It tore through the camp like it had a personal vendetta, and the cold that followed was merciless. This wasn't weather, this felt like divine intervention wearing a storm as a mask. Abu Sufyan stood in the wreckage of his command tent, shivering, and realized something that every general fears. His army's will to fight was broken, not by swords, not by strategy, by cold, by hunger, by paranoia, and now by a storm that felt like the universe itself was telling them to leave. He gathered his commanders and said the words that ended the siege. "We're done. Pack up. We leave tonight." Some of them protested. They still had the numbers. They still had the supplies. But Abu Sufyan wasn't listening to logic anymore. He was listening to the wind howling through the ruins of his camp and the fear in his soldiers' eyes. The coalition had come to erase Islam from existence. Instead, they were retreating in the middle of the night like thieves, defeated by a ditch, a double agent, and a storm they couldn't fight. By dawn, the battlefield was empty. When the sun rose over Medina, the companions standing guard along the trench saw something they almost couldn't process. Nothing. No tents, no campfires, no army. Just empty desert and the distant trails of dust where 10,000 men had been. They'd survived, not by killing, not by charging into glorious battle, but by enduring, by digging when they were starving, by standing watch when they were freezing, by holding the line when everything inside them screamed to run. The trench remained, for weeks afterward, a scar in the earth that reminded everyone who passed it of the night an empire-sized army came to destroy a community of 3,000 and left with nothing. Modern military analysts still study this siege, not because of the tactics, though those were brilliant, but because of what it revealed about warfare that we've somehow forgotten in the age of drones and missiles. Sometimes winning has nothing to do with how hard you can hit. Sometimes it's about how much cold you can endure, how much hunger you can survive, how long you can stand in the dark, shivering, with a stone tied to your stomach and your family behind you, and refuse to break. The Sahaba didn't conquer that night. They outlasted. They didn't defeat Abu Sufyan's army with swords, they exhausted it with patience. And in doing so, they proved something that echoes through history. Faith isn't just belief. It's the insulation that keeps you warm when the world goes cold. It's the fuel that keeps you digging when your body says stop. It's the certainty that the frozen ground beneath your bleeding hands will one day become a fortress, and the empires you were promised in the depths of that ditch will one day fall to the children of the people who refused to surrender to the winter.